please join me in welcoming award-winning author to discuss his new book, Normal, Mr. Warren Ellis. Thanks so much for joining us today. Please have a seat. So how you doing? I know you mentioned you were a little tired, and now we're hitting these bright lights.
Yes. That's what you need after 4 hours sleep, interrogation lights.
Well, hopefully today's weather sort of made you feel more at home. It's
yeah, because the joke about where I live in Britain is you can normally only tell it's summer when the rain gets warmer.
Sounds good. Being from Kansas myself, they say if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes.
Yes, we've got that too. But Elaine Stritch used to say that when she lived in London. But the weirdest weather joke I ever heard actually was in Bergen in Norway, where a tourist stops a little kid and says, "Does it always rain here?" And the kid says, "I don't know, I'm only 11.
Yeah, seems good. Seems good. So we want to talk about Normal, which is a novel in a sort of collected fashion. It's a techno-thriller, at times even James Bond-esque, but with this twist that everyone involved is just completely insane.
Yes. James Bond-esque. Having written James Bond recently, I would say that this is probably, a lot more like the carry-on version of James Bond. It's a lot funnier.
It is quite funny, but also
Really depressing?
terrifying.
Yeah, I've gotten that a lot.
In what ways, like, it's strange to be confronted with something that is seemingly obvious. So the novel takes place in the near future. Is that accurate to say? It's kind of the now future.
Honestly, I would call it contemporary.
Yeah. But it looks at technology, surveillance, things that are going on in a way that I think a lot of normal people don't. Would you think that that's accurate?
Yeah, I'd give you that. It's a little sideways in places. But unfortunately, a lot of the stuff in that book, particularly around surveillance and drones, has been in the academic literature for the last 3-4 years. It's one of those things. This actually happens to me a lot, where people say, "Oh, you made that up. How clever of you." And I say, no, the terrible truth is I didn't make it up, you just didn't know about it.
Right. It's interesting. These sort of, well, let's dive in a little bit, because I feel like we're talking around. Let's get into some specifics. You got kind of two classes of, well, it takes place in a mental institution, a type of mental.
It's basically a rest home for terminally depressed futurists.
that have self-segregated into two groups.
That have self-segregated into two groups, having spent a lot of time around futurists in the last 10 years. There is kind of a demarcation. It's not as sharp as it is in the book. That's very much just a function for the book. But there are the people who work in foresight for some version of the common good. And there are the people who work in foresight in order to give their forecasts to corporations and state actors.
And you say work in foresight. Explain that a little bit more, because I have read the book. I don't know if everyone else has. So explain what you mean by this.
Foresight, when I say foresight, I basically mean futurism. But a lot of people who do this professionally will talk in terms of foresight strategy. Because it's not just trying to see what's coming down the pike, but trying to prepare for it in some way. People who work in climate change mitigation will describe themselves as working in foresight strategy, because they're not only trying to see what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of climate shift, they're looking at ways to prepare for it and perhaps short-circuit it. These are people who are looking at ways to increase cloud albedo to reflect more heat out, big geoengineering projects. It's futurism, but there is a practical, real-world value gain to the predictive work they're doing.
And in this story, the value gain sort of takes two different angles. One being from utilitarian, like let's save everybody, save the world, and the other side being sort of how do we capitalize on that?
Yeah.
And those two factions are at odds, even though they are kind of doing the same thing.
Even though they're doing the same thing, they don't talk to each other. And in the big courtyard, the outdoor courtyard where they eat and drink, which is the center of much of the action, they've actually created a clear aisle down the middle, and they won't talk to those other people. Those other people are weird, and no.
One of those people happens to be the protagonist of the story, which is Adam. And Adam falls in a bit of a gray space in between this.
Adam actually falls in the middle of the aisle because he started out in strategic forecasting, working for corporations, state actors, spooks. I'm just going to adjust this slightly because I seem to be getting away from the mic. And then had a life change and started working with universities and institutions and non-profits.
And he kind of is the perfect embodiment of an unreliable narrator.
Well,
In the fact that he is completely off his nut.
he's unreliable insofar as he's nuts, which is why he's there at normal head. I'm trying to remember what the actual term is. Normal Head Experimental Station. It's a hospital for crazy futurists that's been built in the middle of an experimental forest in Oregon. So it's about as remote as you can get without being basically floated out into the Pacific. And he's nuts, but his redeeming feature, though, what makes him a less unreliable narrator, is that everyone around him is even crazier.
That was sort of the beauty of it. Is like everyone in this place is crazy, and that's not limited to the patients, it seems, because even the staff, all the way up to the doctors, and then potentially the people who are sort of the shadow behind paying for all this stuff. Everyone seems to have this crazy, complex plot that they're trying to marionette around.
But they're all also extremely intelligent. They all speak very fluently. They're all like hypervocal.
Yeah.
And they make perfect sense in their way. Because some of them are so crazy they don't know they're crazy.
Yeah, it's the make perfect sense rattled. One of the opening people that we meet very early on is a woman who is trying to shiv. She wants the entire internet, and she's holding staff at.
Yeah, she hasn't seen a cat gif in weeks. So she makes a shank out of a toothbrush and demands access to the internet.
Right. But with perfect logic, because she said, I wouldn't have had to have made this shank had you not taken away my world destruction ray.
Yes, yeah. She's had to ruin a perfectly good $10 toothbrush in order to get the internet because they took her death ray away.
That makes perfect sense.
I don't particularly see an issue.
No, not at all.
But I do want a death ray, so it's possible I'm less than reliable as a narrator here too. I don't see why I shouldn't have one.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Especially
I'm an award-winning writer. I've got a fucking medal. Give me a death ray.
It's the affliction that they're going through, you refer to as abyss gaze.
Abyss gaze.
Which is a great, callback to classic literature as well as a very real thing. These people...
And a great hashtag.
Hashtag abyss gaze. It's at the same time this sort of breaking under the pressure of figuring out the future. In my association with these people, as I got interested in the field over the last 10, 15 years, it became very clear to me within a couple of years that a lot of people who work in this field, particularly the more existentially terrifying regions of the field, like climate change forecast, like geoengineering, it exerts a terrible, terrible toll mentally. Particularly if you're one of those people, and many are, who are already prone to depression or mood change.
I've met several people who can actually only work in these fields for like 18 months at a time, and then they get put to bed with a shitload of Valium for 6 months because it's really hard on you when you realize that all you're doing every day is looking at versions of the end of the world. You have to be neurotypical to the point of essentially being a bit of fucking timber to get through that without taking on any damage. It's a rough job.
Isn't this what you do as a writer, though?
Oh yes, but I'm neurotypical to the point of probably being a sociopath, so it's less of an issue for me.
So maybe there's some normal head in your future. if somebody should.
I already live by the sea in a town where I don't know anybody and I don't talk to anyone for weeks at a time. I'm basically there, except I own the place. It's not an issue.
Maybe a little less medication. Maybe a little more.
I'm fine. I've got whiskey and stockpiled food. What else do I need?
It does lead me. Actually, let's start. We talked about Biscay.
I'm sorry, this is the first talk I've done in over a year, and it's clearly broken me within 15 minutes.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. It's okay.
We mentioned the Biscays. There was something that we had talked about before, a very particular part of the book that relates. If you want to take a moment, you want to hear him read a little bit from the book. And this particularly pertains to New York, so I thought that this would be a good example of.
This bit is always weird for me because in Britain we grew up with a television show called Jack and Ori, which was celebrities and writers and actors who would sit and read children's books on television for 15 minutes a day. And it always began with, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." And this is one of the most uncomfortable bits of the book. So if you are sitting uncomfortably, then I'll begin. This is, the person who's speaking is Layla Charon, and she's an urbanist, gathering lots and lots of data about cities and how they work, and then giving it to people and never finding out what they do with it, which is how urbanism tends to work. And she says, "The data never fails me, and that's the problem. You spend all day thinking of cities as machines for living in, and as the data piles up and you realize the scale of the problems that cities are intended to solve, you start thinking of the city as a suit of armor to survive in." I mean, in theory and practice, that's exactly what they are. That's why cities used to have earthworks and walls around them. A city is supposed to have everything in it that its citizenry needs to live. If I'm sick and I live in a city, it's almost certain that the care I need is closer to me than if I lived in a house in the country, because all the hospitals are in big towns and cities. People in what we think of as a basic Western city simply live longer. And I mean basic, not, collapsing and feral. Basic. Which means they fill up with old people, huddled up against the health services they need and can afford, and all the other civic machinery that keeps their spaces livable. Adam put his hand on the table where hers had been open and said, "I'm sorry, you don't need to go on." "I do though," Layla said. "I do need to go on because you need to hear it. Everybody does. I have to track shit to do my job. Literally. I literally had to track the passage of shit through pipes in 5 major cities for 6 months at one point. The way we move shit around in cities is fucking vital. It affects the condition of the urban environment, the volume of humans that can be supported therein, the quality of the water, and the state of the ecology outside the city, at least. And then, yes, I had to hand over my data to the city authorities because that's what I was hired to do. I don't get to make the decisions. All I can do is overwhelm them with data and reports until they have no choice but to do the right thing. But they don't, because nobody can hold the right thing in their heads. It's too big, and it's too deep. You know what I'm talking about. She cast her hand across the gathered mass of people on the patio. They all know what I'm talking about. I got sent to New York. Fucking New York. They pump more than 13 million gallons of water out of New York every day just to keep the fucking subway running, so that people can perform 10,000 felonies a year on it. And that's the small number. New York needs to pump another 200 million gallons of water out of 4,500 acres of city every single day to stop the city from drowning in its own piss and bath water, and the sea creeping up to grab at the ankles of the 2 million people south of 75th Street. That is one system, only one, and just in Manhattan. The 5 boroughs have to process more than 1 billion gallons a day. Remember Hurricane Sandy? Sandy took out half the pumps and almost all the treatment plants in a fucking second, and that was just barely a Category 1 hurricane when it hit. A 13-foot surge over the wall by Battery Park. That released 10 billion gallons of raw sewage into the city and the surrounding waters. Shit. Big storm comes, and we can't protect ourselves from our own shit. That's the future, Adam fucking whatever your name is. City-states rammed with aging people huddling up against hospitals and looking up in terror for the big storm that will come and go and leave them floating face down in 13 feet of shit. And I can't do anything about it. None of us can. We just look at this stuff. We look wider and deeper, and then just deeper and fucking deeper, and everything we see, all we can see is everything getting smaller and darker until it's this infinite black dot of compressed shit and horror. And we get paid for that. That's the amazing thing. We get paid to stare down the black silo of the future and gaze at the pebble at the bottom that's nothing but the crushed remains of the species. That's where we all end up. That's all we do. And there's a dollar value on that. We get given money for it. It's like we're the sin eaters for the entire fucking culture, looking at the end of human civilization because it's supposed that somebody should. I'm fine, by the way. Stop looking for a nurse. I'm going to staging soon. I'm going back to work. Society needs people to stare at a ball of shit at the end of the world all day. It's a living.
Yeah.
Very cheerful book. Give it to people for Christmas.
Well, and it's easy to see how the characters who do this day after day for these sort of mundane things that we might just walk right past and not think about can fall into this despair, and it got me to think about other work that you've done and this sort of you do really great work in this near future or not too far flung future, and I was wondering how you go about selecting everyday mundane items that you're going to evolve into the necessary future, while also keeping it so grounded, because it's not like, today we have phones, tomorrow it's whatever implant in the back of your brain
Right.
that broadcasts on the front of your eye. It's like okay, but how do you?
I remember like back in 1999, 2000, people taking the piss out of me for being so interested in phones. I did an Iron Man project, Extremis, which turned into like part of Iron Man 1 and most of Iron Man 3. And I got a whole rush of like hate mail and bullshit. And this was, I guess I wrote this around 02, 03, somewhere around there. Tony Stark causes a Stark phone to be created. I think like, Tony Stark would make mobile phones? Why would Tony Stark, Iron Man, bother with cell phones? And I feel vaguely vindicated. Because it is always the small things. It's never the big things. It's never flying cars. It's never jetpacks. It's not the things. It's never Segways. You remember when the Segway was released and people said it would change the way people design cities? Not so much. Although there are still weird enclaves of Segway users. I was in Berlin. I was getting a cab to the airport. And out of nowhere, this convoy of people on Segways went past. And they were all dressed the same. It was like the Segway cult of West Berlin. out for a Sunday drive. It was the strangest thing.
I remember seeing Segway police in Köln in Germany.
Yeah.
Which is very strange. It's a nice, cute little town, and in the center there's an area where there are giant billboards that say, "You're going to get pickpocketed here, so be careful." But all the police were rolling around on Segways, and I thought that was wildly impractical.
Oh, yeah.
You got to get up on it and then bail off and tackle somebody. I don't know.
I mean, that's the crappiest police chase ever, isn't it?
Or the most amazing.
Some guy running down the road and a cop on a Segway saying, "Run slower!"
Unless he thinks he can get on a Segway and then.
Well, I mean, unless they turbocharge the things now. You know,
Or the chase is just slow.
I'm just picturing a Segway with like a can of nitrous on the side now.
Well,
with a fast chase.
maybe in the next project.
Yeah.
Rocket-powered Segways and death race.
But it's always the small things. I mean, going back to mobile phones, mobile phones are the one thing cyberpunk fiction never saw coming. You'll never see a phone in any of the science fiction of the 80s. Because prediction will always get you into trouble. Prediction is always a really fast way of making yourself look stupid. Because it's not times arrow. The future is not times arrow. There is not one future coming down the pike at us. It's an entire weather front. And anyone who tells you they can predict exactly where lightning strikes is either an idiot or nuts. You have to forecast. You have to take your best guesses. But it's always going to be one or two or three things hitting in the places you don't expect.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned the cell phones. There's also, the internet will tell you that you invented Twitter prior to Twitter.
Well, we don't trust the internet anymore, Matthew.
Of course not. Of course not. But these, as someone who has, right? I mean, in 2012, we spoke earlier about a talk you did about looking forward into a better world, the edge of tomorrow, or
I can't even remember what that thing was. That was the one at Improving Reality where I talked about people walking into Martian orbit, I think.
You said the best quote. We live in the science fiction condition, which is, I love the idea that these things, these sort of future projections, the small things that we've talked about, if we took somebody randomly and said, "Oh, describe for me the future phone," they may do that 5 years out, and then you'd be able to say, like, "Oh, but we have that now."
Right. I mean, I said in the talk, people always go back to like Star Trek as a touchstone for the future. And you forget that Captain Kirk had to tune his fucking communicator. And he couldn't even take a picture with it, let alone stick a nice sepia filter on that picture. It was. I mean, on Star Trek Next Generation, they clearly fly it around using iPads, but the future we live in is in so many ways so much more interesting than the one we were promised, because we didn't see so much of it coming.
Well, and it's another big theme in the novel, this idea of not knowing how far into the future you might actually be. Because he encounters, one of the big things that comes up is drone surveillance. And we maybe don't know. We don't know. We think of drones as being huge quadcopter, parrot-looking things that you fly around.
Yeah.
But in fact, current technology is very far ahead of that.
Yes.
So this idea of we might be surrounded by future that we're not paying any attention to.
Yeah. And also, I mean, this is actually the cyberpunk element, which is this stuff trickles down onto the street, which has its own use for things in the old saw. And I knew something was up. I was in LA about 3 years ago, I want to say, and I got buzzed by a small quadcopter drone with a camera on it on my hotel balcony. And that was clearly just, something a guy picked up off Amazon and was just flying around the area. But, I mean, there's also obviously a whole bunch of stuff we don't know about or only gets covered in the academic literature and gets buried as an abstract that you can't access unless you're prepared to pay or fiddle far around. There's always a lot going on under the radar. as it were. And it's always massively unpredictable whether or not that's going to pop up in the mainstream or whether it coasts along.
You mentioned before that predictions can get you in trouble, but I'm wondering if, from the current vantage point, if you are able to look back at some of the things that you've predicted, what are some of your greatest hits that, oh man, I totally saw that coming, or potentially greatest miss?
Well, if you ask TRANSMETROPOLITAN readers, it's probably two-headed cats. Every time there's a new two-headed cat born, my public email just gets drenched. Look what I found! It's this freaky two-headed cat, and they're fucking horrible. And I wish people wouldn't do it. I don't know, because I tend not to think in these terms so much. I mean, TRANSMETROPOLITAN is probably riddled with stuff that was interesting. I didn't necessarily think or state that it was going to happen, but it spoke to some of the themes in TRANSMETROPOLITAN about the nature of media and democratization of media. So when you had things like the feed site listeners who were just people out on the streets with streaming kit, that was interesting when that actually started happening. Which happened when it started happening. It started happening before most people noticed. Guys at Indie Media in California actually hacked together a street streaming kit in like '03.
And now you can do it
from
from
4 camera phones.
Yeah, now you can do it from any phone
Now you
via
can-
multiple platforms of social media.
Yeah. It was really strange to see that one particularly happen for real.
Anything that you see in the current landscape that you're like, that's one to watch?
You know, I've been thinking about this all year. I was very interested in AR like 3 or 5 years ago when Blippar and Layar and those guys were doing it in Holland. And it was a horrible false start because the only thing they could think of to use it for was to help estate agents sell houses, which was embarrassing. I remember Bruce Sterling went out there and gave a talk to those AR guys, and he says, right now, you're getting flooded with money to try all this stuff with AR. What I want you all to do is go out and buy good beds, because in 18 months, this is all going to go away, and I'd really like you guys to have something to show for it. And horribly, he was right. AR went away and didn't really come back to any kind of mainstream notice until Pokemon Go.
Which also immediately tanked.
Which also, it seemed to have a very steep slope up
something
and
like
down.
70% drop off after the sort of honeymoon period.
Wow.
So major flash in the pan there.
I still think there's something to AR. I don't know if there's going to be the money, frankly, to throw into it, or the depth of thought, because it's entirely possible people are just going to look at AR as a gaming function, which I think would be a shame. And I don't really expect to see people wearing Microsoft HoloLenses in the streets anytime soon.
It may also depend on, one of the other themes is the money behind these people looking forward. It could be just a situation of the money behind it.
Yeah, it is all about the money. All the things that are interesting right now, to me, really are about the dollars first. I'm very interested in the M Drive, which is a space drive that appears to be essentially free. It requires no fuel, and it appears to create thrust through microwave interaction in the drive Ventura. And I'm guessing that's going to be tested in space next year. They're talking about like 6 or 7 months before they get a test article up in orbit to see if it works in actual space as opposed to simulated vacuums. If that works, that's awfully interesting. Because
Our ticket off the planet.
That's the moon in 18 hours, and that's Mars in 40 to 70 days, depending on orbital positions. Because I've always been interested in space travel. Ethically, there are issues around the idea of colonizing other planets. And I understand and I appreciate all those issues. But in the history of everything, it has never ever been a clever idea to have all your breeding pairs in one place. So I remain relatively centered on colonization as, I guess, forward escape would be a little harsh, but something along those lines. Mars obviously is a terrifying shithole that will poison anybody who tries to stay there for more than 4 days.
But it can't be any worse.
You would have to nuke it and then drill a hole into the core and then stuff all the nukes you've got down in there to try and restart the core to create a magnetic field, or else you will just, fry, shrivel. There are people talking about sending like human DNA to Mars as like some ultimate safeguard for the species. So provided it survived the trip through space, which would probably fry it all into fossilized taffy, you've then got to get it way under the Martian surface before the radiation environment of Mars finishes it off there. It's horribly pointless. I'm happy to see people go there and try it, but I'm never going to be one of them.
Do I need to call for a nurse? You're okay? Looking too deep?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
I do want to give plenty of time for you guys to ask questions as well. So if you guys want to start making your way to the microphones, we'll do that. I did want to shift gears before we go to Q&A, though, and talk about the book is published by FSG.
Yes.
And it was originally published in 4 parts.
Yeah, we were talking about it as a novel, but that's a very grand term. It's basically a novella because I'm essentially a very lazy person. And we serialized it. The original plan was to serialize it in 4 parts over the summer digitally. I liked the idea of people who were interested could order the first part, and if they liked it, they could pre-order the other 3 parts, so that the other 3 chapters would be automatically delivered to their Kindle. I like the idea of a series that just automatically delivers itself on a Monday morning. Mm-hmm. Because I'm lazy, as I think I mentioned.
Well, I was wondering about the serialization and how it affected the construction of the story. Did you have the whole story and then think to yourself, well, I want to split it into these segments? Or?
I spent so long in comics, and comics, particularly commercial American comics, have very prescribed shapes. Each chapter is 20 or 22 pages. That's it. If you've run long, you don't get the extra page. That is the length of a comic book. So I'm kind of very deeply programmed for even chaptering at this point. So it's a very boring answer, but it was very easy for me to find the breaks because I'm just built that way now.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. We had a question.
Yes, hi, this is Matti from Finland. I'm very excited to have you here. So I'm a huge fan of Transmetropolitan, and I know the first story was written 20 years ago, so I'm not sure if you're bored with hearing people ask you about that.
Or in fact, if I even remember anything about it, but fire away, we'll find out.
Let's give it a try anyway. So I'm not sure about you inventing Twitter, but to me, in the first story, I think, this concept of, real-time Twitter journalism, to me, it feels like that was kind of, the first, at least the first instance that I know about it. So kind of the promise of this sort of, how Spider Jerusalem, he's there in real time, he's providing the truth to people there. No one else has access to that. Whereas these days, you would kind of think that with this being possible and available to everyone around the world, more or less, you'd think that there'd be more, objective truth. However, this year, the word of the year being post-truth and no one knowing what to really believe in, I mean, how does that make you feel? What do you think about that?
There's Hunter Thompson, before he lost what was left of his mind, said something that I found very interesting, which is, if you want pure objective journalism, buy a CCTV camera. There's one in my local store, and it provides an absolute objective take on everything that happens in that store. Otherwise, accept that all other journalism is subjective, and it just has to be presented with intelligence and passion. And engagement. Post-truth politics, post-truth media happen not least because of the hot take, I think. I think that's a big part of it. Because we could do these things instantly, the second they occurred to us, all of us in the Western world could just fire it off into the ether and, yes, I have spoken. I am the people's pundit. Because of that, engagement got devalued. Engagement didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the hot take. I'm not sure whose door I would lay the fault at, but I think that's one of the things that didn't work out so well for us in the days of instant publishing and live blogging. The volume of noise and the lack of engagement on the part of the people producing that noise.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question.
I've seen this idea floating around that the upcoming century will not see as much progress as the previous century, basically because we've sort of figured all the easy stuff out already. Do you think there's anything to that? Do you think it's impossible to tell?
At the end of the 19th century, it was, I think, the head of the Royal Society, big scientific institution in London, who said, the project of science is now complete, aside from two things we haven't quite worked out yet, which were black body radiation and the luminiferous ether. So I take your point. Things, in some ways, it feels like it's been slowing down. Honestly, probably in the field of consumer technology. Things probably feel like they've stalled out a little bit, but I tend to think not. 3 years ago, we took a photo of the shadow thrown by a single atom. I think we've got a ways to go.
Right, thanks.
While he makes his way to the mic, I wanted to ask quickly about the next FSG. You're writing a nonfiction book about.
I'm contracted for a nonfiction book and have been for a few years, and my editor over there is looking away and making a face. I gave a talk at Cognitive Cities in Berlin, I guess 4 or 5 years ago now. And I showed them the talk and they said, there's a book in that. It's the future of the city. It's also an exploration of some of the stuff I touch on in that bit I read with Leela. So yeah, I'm going to look at that next year and see if I can actually get that finished.
Great. Sounds like it should be very uplifting.
It will be very cheerful. It'll be the feel-good summer book.
Great. Let's go over here.
Hi. So, with all of the time you spent staring down the black hole into the future, if you could pluck one thing that's going to probably turn up in the next 50 years just for your own satisfaction out of the ether today, what would it be?
Something that will happen.
Probably.
See, I hate doing that because prediction is such a clown show and it's such a quick way to make yourself look even more stupid and uneducated than you actually are. Oh, God. One thing. That's actually really tough. That's actually really tough.
We could go with something that's not necessarily going to happen. I don't know.
That is so random. I'm not
can you
sure.
spot a misstep that society's currently on? Like,
I'm very interested as a side thing in the repurposing of viruses for medical care. Vaccines actually being buried inside cold viruses, for instance. I very much like the mechanization of the biome, if you like, for very, very strictly targeted medical purposes that other more technical and invasive procedures simply can't touch. I really like the idea of attacking disease and aging, essentially on the bacterial level. And I think that's probably got some legs to it.
Thank you.
Hi. So arguably one of the things from Transmetropolitan that came true in real life is the idea of a president manipulating the media, coming to power, and using that to good effect. So my question would be, who are today's Spider Jerusalems, according to you?
Matt Taibbi is very good. I like him. Greg Palast has always been Spider Jerusalem. He's always been a cranky old bastard who is just convinced that everybody is lying to him. So Greg is always worth watching. I've dropped out a lot this year, so I don't know. I don't quite know who else to mention here. Mostly because I'll mostly end up listing, I think, Angry Old Men, which of course Spider was. And I think there's more value in considered positions. People like Melissa Guerra-Grant, who I know is going to do some work out in some of the swing states next year, talking to women and trying to understand the impact of the media landscape on them in places that are not necessarily deep internet culture. And it's very much television, word of mouth, newspapers. There's not been a lot of work done on that, and I'll be interested to see what she does there.
I think we got time for one more.
So you, in your book, had a passage that reminded me a lot. The passage that you read reminded me a lot of Bruce Sterling's "Old People in Cities is Afraid of the Sky." So he's now sort of in this futurist vein. Who else would you recommend paying attention to?
In futurism?
In the forecasting and futurism.
Rachel Armstrong is worth a lot. She's a synthetic biologist, and she's throwing up a lot of interesting ideas, has been over the last few years. Jamais Cascio is an old friend who works in climate forecast and geoengineering. That'll probably do to start with, won't it?
Excellent. Thanks.
All right, so we do need to wrap up, but before we go, I'm wondering if you can take a little bit of a look into your own future and share with us some of the things that you're currently working on, or some things that might be coming out very soon that people who are big fans can look forward to. Are you able to talk at all about the DC?
I'm literally doing the calculation in my head to try and decide what I can actually talk about without getting murdered by somebody or other. Because that's the way it works these days. There was a period in the late summer where like 90% of my body weight was NDAs. And as you've noticed, I'm not a small mammal. DC Comics, I'm at DC Comics for a couple of years. They asked me to come back and revive the old Wildstorm line from the 90s, which was some of my earliest work in comics. So it forced me to reread some of my old stuff. That was horrifying. My graphic novel I do with Jason Howard Trees has been optioned for television, and I'm working on the adaptation of that. At the moment, let's see, can't talk about that. Let's assume I'm just doing lots of interesting things and life is good.
Fair enough. Well, the book is called Normal. It's available from FSG. I would like to thank you, please, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it.